It was a quiet morning in a small neighborhood where life moved at its own slow pace. The sun was just starting to rise, sending soft golden light through the thin curtains of a modest little house. In the kitchen, the smell of toast filled the air as a man stood at the counter making breakfast for his daughter. He had always tried to make mornings warm and calm for her. Life hadn't been easy since it was just the two of them. Being a single parent meant there was no one else to share the load, but he had learned to balance work, household chores, and raising his little girl. It wasn't perfect, but they had each other, and that was enough for him. His daughter, a bright-eyed 7-year-old, had a quiet way about her. She loved to observe things, ask questions, and sometimes say the strangest things that made him pause and wonder where her thoughts came from. That morning, she sat at the table, swinging her small legs back and forth, watching him butter her toast. "Daddy," she said softly. He turned, smiling at her. "Yes, sweetheart." She leaned in a little, lowering her voice like she was about to share the most important secret in the world. "It's behind that wall," she whispered. Her tone caught him off guard. It wasn't the playful whisper of a child telling a joke. It was serious, almost too serious for her age. He froze for a moment, holding the butter knife mid-air, unsure how to respond. "Behind what wall?" he asked, trying to keep his voice light. She glanced toward the back of the house, her eyes fixed on a specific direction. "In the small room," she said quietly. "The one with the boxes and the old shelf. There's something there." He raised an eyebrow. "Something." She nodded once, her expression calm but certain. At first, he wanted to laugh it off. Maybe she had been reading too many mystery books or imagining adventures like the ones in her cartoons. But there was something in her eyes, a quiet certainty, that made him curious. He remembered the little room she was talking about. It was a narrow space at the far end of the house, barely used except for storing a few things they didn't need every day. He had never thought much about it, other than how awkwardly shaped it was. One side of the wall seemed a little off, now that he thought about it. But he had never cared enough to take a closer look. "Did you see something there yesterday?" he asked. She shook her head. "I just know it's there." He wanted to ask how she could possibly know, but before he could, the toaster popped, and the sound broke the moment. She picked up her toast and took a small bite like nothing unusual had just happened. He tried to brush it off, but the words stuck in his mind. "It's behind that wall." What could she mean? Was she just playing, or had she overheard something? After breakfast, she went to her room to get ready for school, leaving him in the kitchen with his thoughts. He leaned against the counter, sipping his coffee, and looked toward the back of the house. The morning light was now spilling across the floor, casting shadows that reached all the way to that little unused room. For a second, he almost went to check it right then and there. But he reminded himself he had work to do and a school drop-off to make. Still, it nagged at him. Kids sometimes notice things adults overlook. They see details without meaning to, details that slip past grown-ups caught up in daily routines. Later that morning, as they walked to the car, she slipped her small hand into his. "Don't forget," she said, almost as if reading his mind. "Forget what?" he asked. "The wall," she replied simply. Her words made the back of his neck prickle. It wasn't fear exactly, more like the strange feeling you get when someone tells you something that feels important, even if you don't understand why. On the way to school, he kept replaying her voice in his head. He knew kids sometimes made up stories for attention, but Lily wasn't that type. She wasn't a child who constantly invented things or tried to trick people. She had a thoughtful way of speaking, and when she said something, she usually meant it. By the time he dropped her off, the curiosity was already growing stronger. He told himself he'd take a closer look when he got home. Maybe there was nothing there, maybe it was just a dent in the wall or some uneven plaster. But a part of him, a quiet and curious part, hoped it might be something more. That day at work, he found himself distracted. He was answering emails, making calls, but his mind kept wandering back to that small room. The image of his daughter's serious face wouldn't leave him. By the time evening came and he picked her up from school, she didn't bring it up again. She talked about art class and how her friend brought a pet turtle for show and tell. But as soon as they got home, she walked straight past the kitchen, past the living room, and down the narrow hallway toward that small storage room. He followed her slowly, watching as she stopped in front of the wall and placed her small hand against it. She didn't say anything, just looked at it quietly. "You really think something's here?" he asked, feeling almost silly for playing along. She turned to him with a small nod. "Yes." And that was it. She didn't explain how she knew, and he didn't ask again. But the seed of curiosity had already been planted in his mind. That night, after she went to bed, he stood in that little room with the lights off, just looking at the wall. The air felt still, and the silence pressed in around him. He couldn't help but wonder, what if she was right? The next morning, he woke up earlier than usual. Sleep hadn't come easily the night before. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that wall in his mind, and his daughter's calm, certain expression. After making coffee, he walked quietly down the hallway to the small storage room. The house was still, and the early light slipped through the curtains in thin streams. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room wasn't much. An old wooden shelf stood against one side, holding a few dusty boxes, some cleaning supplies, and a folded-up chair they never used. The floor creaked under his weight as he walked in. His eyes moved to the wall Lily had pointed to. It didn't look like anything special. Off-white paint, a bit of peeling near the bottom, and a faint line in the wallpaper that might have been from age. But as he stared, he noticed something odd. The wall didn't quite line up with the rest of the room. It was slightly forward, like it had been built over something else. He crouched down, running his fingers along the baseboard. It felt different, almost hollow. He tapped it lightly with his knuckle, and the sound it made wasn't solid. It was faint, like there was an empty space behind it. A shiver ran down his spine. Part of him wanted to grab a hammer and start right then, but this wasn't his house. He was just renting it. The landlord might not appreciate him tearing into the walls without permission. After breakfast, he decided to make a call. The landlord was a man named Mr. Carson, a tall, well-dressed man in his 50s, who always carried himself like someone important. In fact, he was important. He was the CEO of a construction company. That was why, when the call connected, and James told him about the wall, there was a pause on the other end. "A wall in the storage room?" Carson asked, his voice curious but guarded. "Yes. My daughter pointed it out yesterday. I know it sounds strange, but I think there might be something behind it." Carson chuckled softly. "And how would your daughter know that?" "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "She just knew. And now that I've looked at it, the wall does seem unusual." Another pause. "You know," Carson said slowly, "that property has been in my family for a long time. My grandfather built it himself, decades ago. But I've never heard about a hidden wall." "Well, I think you should come take a look," James replied. By the end of the call, Carson had agreed to come by later that week. He would bring a couple of his workers to inspect it. When James hung up, Lily came into the room. "Was that about the wall?" she asked, like she already knew. "Yes," he said. "Mr. Carson is coming to check it." She didn't smile, didn't look surprised. She just nodded and said, "Good." The days that followed felt longer than usual. Every time he passed the storage room, he found himself stopping at the doorway, staring at the wall. It was strange how something so ordinary could suddenly feel important. On the day Carson was set to arrive, James woke early again. He tidied the house, cleared space in the storage room, and made sure Lily had a front row spot to see whatever was going to happen. When the knock came at the door, Carson stood there in a neat suit, but he wasn't alone. Two men in work clothes followed behind him, carrying a set of tools. "All right," Carson said, stepping inside with a polite nod. "Let's see this mysterious wall." Lily led the way, small and quiet, like a guide on a mission. They all crowded into the narrow room, the air thick with curiosity. One of the workers ran his hand along the wall and gave a low whistle. "He's right," the man said to Carson. "This part doesn't match the original layout. Could be a false wall." Carson frowned, turning to James. "Well, shall we find out?" The room felt smaller with everyone standing inside, and the air carried that quiet tension that comes right before something is about to happen. Carson glanced at his workers and gave a small nod. "Let's be careful," he said. One of the men took out a small tool and began tapping different parts of the wall. The sound shifted from solid thuds to hollow knocks. "Yep," he murmured, "there's space behind here. Can't tell how big it is yet." James stood beside Lily, his hand resting on her shoulder. She was completely focused, her eyes fixed on the spot where the worker was tapping. She looked calm, but he could feel a faint tremble in her small frame, not from fear, but from the weight of anticipation. The worker marked a section of the wall with chalk, then reached for a hammer. The first strike echoed through the little room, sending a soft rain of plaster dust into the air. With each hit, the sound of the hammer grew sharper, like they were getting closer to something solid behind the plaster. Carson stepped closer, his normally composed expression now showing hints of curiosity. He didn't say much, just watched intently as the opening began to take shape. After a few minutes, the first piece of the wall gave way, revealing darkness behind it. A cool draft spilled out, as if the space had been sealed for years. The worker shone a flashlight through the small gap. "Looks like a compartment," he said slowly. "Not a full room, but something built inside the wall." James felt his pulse quicken. He exchanged a glance with Carson, who looked more intrigued than ever. "Open it more," Carson instructed. They worked carefully, pulling away sections of plaster, and would until the gap was wide enough for a person to peek inside. The beam of the flashlight swept over a narrow space, no bigger than a small closet, but it wasn't empty. Something sat in the shadows, just far enough back that they couldn't make it out completely. It was square-shaped, covered in dust, and had the faint outline of straps or handles. The worker leaned back. "Looks like some kind of old case or box." For a moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was the soft crackle of plaster dust settling on the floor. Lily took a small step forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's it." James looked down at her, a mix of pride and wonder in his chest. She had been right. There was something there. Carson finally moved, stepping toward the opening. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's bring it out." The worker reached in carefully, brushing away the years of dust as he pulled the object forward. When it finally emerged into the light, everyone could see it clearly. An old, weathered leather suitcase, worn smooth from age, with brass buckles dulled by time. Carson didn't touch it right away. He just stared at it, his brow furrowed, as if trying to place a memory. Then, with a slow breath, he knelt beside it. "I've seen this before," he murmured. James tilted his head. "Where?" Carson didn't answer immediately. His fingers brushed the leather, and a strange look crossed his face, part recognition, part disbelief. Carson stayed crouched there for a few seconds, his hand resting on the dusty suitcase like it was something fragile. His normally confident voice was quieter now. This looks exactly like one my grandfather used to carry," he said, almost to himself. James felt the air in the room change. This wasn't just a random find anymore. This meant something to the landlord, something personal. Carson gave a small nod to the worker holding it, and together they lifted the suitcase onto the small table in the room. Dust swirled in the air as it landed with a dull thud. The leather creaked under their hands, and the brass buckles were stiff from years of not being touched. Lily stood on tiptoe, trying to see. James moved her gently to the side, but kept her close. He could feel her excitement buzzing through her small frame. Carson hesitated before unfastening the first buckle. His fingers lingered there, like he was bracing himself for whatever was inside. Finally, with a soft click, the buckle popped open, followed by the second. When he lifted the lid, the hinges groaned, and a faint smell of aged paper and leather drifted out. The room seemed to go completely silent. Inside, neatly stacked, were old letters tied together with faded ribbon. Some envelopes were yellowed, the ink smudged in places from time. Beside them sat a small wooden box with a brass latch, and next to it, a velvet pouch. Carson reached for the letters first. He untied the ribbon carefully, revealing pages filled with handwriting, elegant and old-fashioned. He read a few lines under his breath, his voice catching slightly. "These are my grandfather's letters to my grandmother." James felt a pang in his chest. There was something deeply human about seeing a man, usually so composed and businesslike, holding onto fragile pieces of family history, as if they might vanish if handled too roughly. The worker opened the small wooden box and found several war medals inside, each one carefully placed. The colors of the ribbons had dulled, but the metal still caught the light. Beneath them lay official documents, birth certificates, property deeds, and what looked like personal notes. Then Carson reached for the velvet pouch. When he loosened the drawstring, a soft clinking sound came from inside. He poured the contents into his hand, revealing a delicate gold necklace and a pair of antique earrings. The craftsmanship was beautiful, the kind you rarely see anymore. For a long moment, Carson didn't say anything. He just stared down at the items in his hand, the kind of look someone gets when they're not just looking at an object, but at all the memories attached to it. Finally, he said, "I thought all of this was lost after my grandfather passed. No one in the family could find them. We didn't even know where they might be." James looked toward Lily, who was standing quietly, her eyes wide. "Looks like you were right," he told her softly. She smiled just a little, but said nothing. Carson closed the suitcase gently, as though tucking the past back into its safe place. But his expression had changed. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was gratitude, and something even deeper, like he had just been handed a missing piece of his life. Carson stood there for a moment, holding the necklace gently in his hand like it might crumble if he gripped it too tightly. His eyes weren't on the room anymore. They were far away, somewhere in the past. "When I was a boy," he began slowly, "my grandfather used to tell me stories about this house. He built it with his own hands after returning from the war. Said every corner held a memory. But after he passed away, we lost track of a lot of his things. Some were sold, some were misplaced. Others we thought were gone forever." He looked down at the letters again, his thumb brushing across the faded ink. These are my grandmother's handwriting too. She died when I was just a child. I barely remember her, but I remember how my grandfather would read her letters over and over, like they were treasures." James felt something shift in the room. This wasn't just about a hidden compartment anymore. It was about a lifetime of love, history, and connection that had been locked away for decades. Carson gently set the items back on the table and let out a slow breath. "You have no idea what this means to me," he said, looking at James and then at Lily. "If your daughter hadn't noticed that wall, this might have stayed hidden forever." Lily tilted her head, her voice soft. "I just felt it was there." There was no pride in her tone, just a simple truth. Carson smiled faintly at her, like he was looking at someone much older than her years. One of the workers stepped forward. "Mr. Carson, you want us to seal it back up when we're done?" Carson shook his head. "No, leave it. This part of the house, it should stay open now. It's part of the story." James watched as Carson carefully packed the suitcase again, but this time his movements weren't hesitant. They were gentle, almost protective. It was as if he was cradling something living. When everything was back in place, Carson closed the lid and looked at James with a steady expression. "You've done me a favor I can't repay, but I'll try." James frowned a little. "You don't owe us anything." Carson's voice was calm but certain. "I do, and you'll see why." He turned toward Lily, kneeling so they were at the same level. "You have a gift," he told her. "Most people go through life without noticing what's right in front of them. But you notice. Never lose that." She nodded, her small hands clasped in front of her. Then Carson stood, looking around the room once more. "I think this house is where it's meant to be, and maybe so are you." James didn't know exactly what he meant by that, but there was a sincerity in his tone that made him curious. Carson lingered in the small storage room for a moment longer, running his hand along the rough edges of the broken wall. Then he turned back to James with a look that seemed both firm and kind. "I've been thinking," Carson said quietly. "This house has been in my family for generations, but for years it's been just another property on a list. I rented it out because it was easier than keeping it in the family. But now," he glanced at the suitcase on the table, "now I see it differently." James stayed quiet, unsure where this was going. Carson stepped closer. "You've taken care of this home. You've respected it. And your daughter." He smiled faintly, shaking his head in amazement. "She's brought something back to me I didn't even know I'd lost." Lily tilted her head, not quite understanding, but sensing something important was happening. "That's why," Carson continued, "I want this house to be yours. Permanently." James blinked, certain he had misheard. "Ours? As in, buy it from you?" Carson shook his head. "No, I'm giving it to you. Free and clear." The words hung in the air, almost too heavy to process. James felt his chest tighten, his thoughts scrambling to catch up. "Mr. Carson, I can't accept that. It's too much." "It's exactly right," Carson said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You and your daughter belong here. And after what you've given me today, this is the least I can do." James opened his mouth to protest again, but Lily's small voice broke in. "Daddy, maybe the wall was hiding more than just a suitcase. Maybe it was hiding our home." Her words silenced them both. Carson smiled at her, then reached out and gently squeezed James's shoulder. "Some walls keep things apart. Others bring the right people together." They moved the suitcase into Carson's car, where it would be restored and preserved. But the wall in the little storage room stayed open. A reminder of the day, a child's quiet whisper uncovered more than just old letters and jewelry. That evening, after Carson left, James stood in the hallway watching Lily draw at the kitchen table. The golden glow of the setting sun spilled into the room, painting everything warm. For the first time in years, the future didn't feel uncertain. It felt like a gift, one they had been led to by a small voice and an unshakable sense that something was waiting just beyond the surface. And in that moment, James realized his daughter hadn't just found a hidden wall. She had found a way to change their lives forever.